Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 14th of June, 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. We will be joined by live video Skype link by Alex Thomson. And Alex, of course, will be bringing us his reports from matters in Europe and around the world with Eastern approaches. Well, we're going to get straight off today with the, tragic news of the fire in London.
As this tweet from the London Fire Brigade says, 40 fire engines, 200 firefighters called to Lancaster West Estate tower block early this morning, and you can see what's going on there now. Lots of commentary in the press about what has caused the scale of the fire. We don't know how the fire began, but clearly the cladding on the outside of the building had something to do with it, and that's shown in that image there, with the fire able to climb up the outside of the building. Yes, we've seen. I didn't have a chance to put it into this into the graphics today, but just before we came on air, I saw a graphic showing a floor plan of the building, and just one single central stairwell in this building, Brian. 2 lifts, but of course you don't use those in a fire emergency, and one of them was out of commission anyway. You know, what can we say? There were many warnings that these buildings were hazardous with regard to fire safety over the last period of time. There's a pressure group established to deal with this issue. At least they were putting pressure on. But the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation didn't seem to take any heed of the warnings. Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, had this to say: there will be a great many questions over the coming days. I want to reassure Londoners that we will get the answers. Do you believe him?
No, not at all. I think, as usual, there'll be a big cover-up because, of course, the failure to provide the proper fire detection and suppression equipment is all part of cost cutting, and that is what we have seen year after year after year as local authorities have attempted to cut costs around housing, including, of course, pushing it out sideways to housing associations, which then work everything for profit. So everything is based on cutting costs and cutting corners. And ultimately, as we're seeing here, that puts people's lives at risk.
So the organisation that managed this building was Kensington and Chelsea TMO. I think it was 2011 or so, we did a documentary on this organisation, and I'm going to show that if you're watching the live stream on the UK Column website straight after this programme. But one of the points that was made in that documentary was that originally the TMO had been the Tenants Management Organisation. It was a tenants grouping to help manage the properties. That the name was changed once that was privatised to become Tenant Management Organisation, and they were asking the question, do we get a clue as to what their motivation is? They're managing the tenant in a particular way.
Well, this is all part of the model, Mike. We could have a long discussion about this, but people are saying from across the country that they've been forced out of their council houses in many situations. Of course, what was the advantage of a council house was once a family had it, they had that dwelling for life, they had security of tenure. And then what happened, usually with the scam that we're going to upgrade your property, but if you want the upgrade, you've got to accept the fact that it will no longer be a council house, it will be passed on to a housing association.
Which is a private organisation.
Private, well, quasi-private, Mike, because usually it's a private company, but with input from the local authority. And then the moment the housing associations took over, what people discovered is all sorts of rules, regulations. You can do this, you can't do that. And if you do something that upsets the housing association, then they're issuing warnings, some of them particularly unpleasant, issuing warnings that you can be thrown out of your accommodation. So this is all on the back of austerity. This is all part of the general dismantling of everything to do with what's good in the public sector, in my opinion.
Alex, I don't know if you've been following this story at all, but have you any thoughts on this and on the issue of how these properties are being managed these days?
Well, yes, Mike, on the continent, particularly in Germanic countries like the Netherlands, what you've described, this litany of problems, a degeneration since the Thatcher era onwards, would be unthinkable because the councils regard it as their sacred duty, and so do their electors who won't stand for anything less, to provide sufficient decent housing stock and security of tenure. Of course, on the continental model, security of tenure is even more safeguarded than it is in Britain, and a lot more than in other English-speaking countries outside Europe. But generally, the councils, okay, they have 8 to 10 year waiting lists unless you have particular needs. In the major cities, you have to wait a while. But when you're on the list, that's it. And they do have housing corporations over here, which do operate as private companies. But people attend their shareholders' meetings and hold them to account, not least the city councillors themselves. I'm noticing in the track room people are talking about the possibilities of exploding fridges and of dry risers not working, sprinklers decommissioned, and people leaving junk and furniture in the stairwells. Again, the people have to take their share of the blame as well as the councils, because in a cleaner and more orderly country like the Netherlands, neighbours would be knocking on the door saying, get that furniture out of the way, it's a death trap.
Yeah, okay.
Nevertheless, we're homing in on problems in this country, we would say, as UK is being dismantled from the inside. So let's move across to, what the media is talking about around Brexit. I find it interesting. This is a selection of front pages which the BBC is now touting. Presumably the BBC, on its budget of 3.74 billion, can't produce its own news, so it's having to use front pages from the mainstream press. But this is the sort of stuff we've got. Brexit clock is ticking. EU warns. Fears growing over a Brexit stitch-up as May closes in on coalition deal. And then we've got Entente Cordiale. So May goes into extra time. We said Brexit was a lie. We said that right at the beginning. We said it was a lie. It still is a lie. And of course, people are now discovering that Theresa May and the Conservative parties have lied and lied again. And it's going to take those 17 million Brexit voters to stand up again and be counted before we can deal with it. But this is the problem. Theresa May has been sleeping with the enemy. So we've got the Daily Telegraph here with a little cosy. I did say, Mike, you're smiling, but I did say that Macron, he likes older women. He was making a move on our Prime Minister. And it's not just there on the Telegraph. We've got it on the Times. Daily Mail here on the right, Entente Cordiale again. So, you know, if we focus in on this is the key thing. She slept with him, figuratively, but what was conceived? We have no idea, because none of this is being debated in public. Everything is being done behind closed doors.
Well, I will be giving a clue as to one part of that later on, actually.
Of course, we could start talking about the bedroom tax, which is another nasty little thing brought in by the UK government, but whether that applies to Theresa May and Macron, I don't know.
Okay, let's move across the continent. And Alex, we have our coalition problems in this country. I believe that there will be no announcement on the potential agreement between Theresa May and the Democratic Unionist Party from Northern Ireland today because of what happened in London. But in Holland, you have the same kinds of problems, the coalition unable to be formed. So in the Netherlands, does that mean you are effectively ungoverned at the moment?
Oh, believe me, the regulations and tax carry on just as normal. But okay, there's always a bit of a delay in the Netherlands because of the parties having to horse trade. Because as I've mentioned before, there's 2 or 3 versions of each of the British mainstream parties. And so you've got a dozen parties having to horse trade. But no, this is exceptional. We had our general election 3 months ago. And the 2 largest parties, respectively, are the sort of Liberal/Tory mainstream party of the Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, and number 2, Geert Wilders, with the anti-immigration PVV, or Freedom Party, which is being kept out by a kind of surgical wall around them by the mainstream parties. And that's what has caused this current impasse. A lot of the students voted, as with the Corbynistas in Britain, for the far left parties, which promised free everything on someone else's money. And when it came to the crunch, the worst of these, or I should say the most left-wing, called the Green Left Party, which is a fusion of parties which used to be called the Communists, the Radicals, the Christian Dreamers, etc. Their leader, who is yet another one of these Trudeau or Macron young men who prefers older women, said, "I'm sorry, I'm going to pull out and waste 3 months of negotiation." And this has caused astonishment among the Prime Minister Rutte's own party, the centrist VVD, but also some of the left-wing coalition partners, because there was an agreement within international law about what would be done with the large number of people who have arrived at Schiphol Airport or crossed the land border from safe third countries, which the EU and the Netherlands have on lists as safe countries to return people to who fail asylum claims. But Klaver said, we're not sending them back even to Tunisia or Turkey. Because it's absolutely unacceptable. We as a party didn't deserve that. So he's got some very astonished voters against him as a result of that, some self-confessed socks and sandals wearing liberals who've said, well, I'll never vote for you again, you're too young and foolish. It's now coming out today in the Dutch news that it seems a couple of these older women in his party, the former leader Femke Halsema and the number 2 Catalina Buitenweg, seem to have taken him by the hand and said, no, this is the idealistic course you are to chart. Don't let one person be sent back to North Africa. So he stymied the whole thing. And if they got into the government, he would have done this at European level. He, as a government junior coalition partner, would have said to the European Union, there'll be no agreement with the Netherlands on sending anyone back. So quite astonishing, really, that people of such pure Marxist principles are within a whisker of power.
Okay, well, let's move on to Hungary then, and Viktor Orban. And we have a little video clip that we're going to run here of him giving a speech. I'm just going to read what he says here. He says the European Union is a voluntary alliance of sovereign European nation states. He then goes on to criticize George Soros. Says that Soros tells Europe what it must do, and for some reason this seems completely natural for Brussels. He says if someone really wanted to help, referring to Soros here, he said the miserable millions in the Middle East and Africa, that he would not spend millions of dollars to fund his network of organizations who disguise themselves as political activists, but would create employment, schools, and build hospitals there where it's really needed. He went on to say, respected ladies and gentlemen, I asked the representatives of the Hungarian parliament in the arguments between the Hungarian government and Brussels not to side with Brussels, but with Hungary. He said, I asked the representatives of the Hungarian parliament that in the arguments between the Soros mafia and Hungary, please side with the Hungarian people. And then he went on to say that he wants to make it clear that as long as he is the Prime Minister of Hungary and can stand in front of the people in Parliament, that the long fence in our southern border will also stand. So, Alex, give us a bit of the background to this, and also a bit of the response from the European Union, because the European Union has hit back quite hard.
Yes, and in fact, Orban foresaw that this latest manoeuvre by the European Commission would come, so he preempted it. So I'll mention that first, actually. It is that infringement procedures have been brought against the Visegrad 4 countries, the alliance of Central European former monarchies and Christian democratic majority countries in Central Europe, which are the buffer between Germany and Russia. So that's Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and although I don't think there's any procedure against them, Slovakia. So that axis is being pummeled now because they will not take migrant quotas. Again, the same issue that's causing huge problems here in the Netherlands as well. So he came to Parliament as part of a national consultation exercise. And Viktor Orban, this is the Hungarian Prime Minister who migrated from being a communist to a patriot and a Christian Democrat and founded the Fidesz party to basically decommunize the country. He's had a spat with Soros for many years, of course, but it's coming to a head now. And this is the first time, to my knowledge, you can find the video on Vlad Tepes blog, Tepes. If you look on Vlad Tepes blog, you'll find it, a subtitle there. The first time that he's fingered Soros as a mafia leader. And he got the opposition, which has also happened last week in the Polish parliament, another clip we played on my segment, of the opposition booing and howling because he called them out now and said, you're not actually a loyal opposition, you're working for foreign interests, you're a fifth column in the country. And he's unmasked Soros as well as somebody who wants to bring chaos into peaceful parts of the world rather than use the peaceful and richer parts of the world to fund progress in the more chaotic ones.
Well, moving back to the European Union itself, Politico here reporting that the EU Parliament wants to build a new building to host itself. And really, the thing that struck me here, Alex, the question that struck me was, is this because they're just so impressed with the new headquarters that NATO has built that they're feeling a little bit jealous?
I do wonder, Mike. NATO shape and the other NATO buildings there have become a kind of Vatican City state, as you've reported. The Belgians declared the ceremony of handover as being from Belgium to NATO, which implies they have extraterritoriality. And you could say that the EU, well, it has that at law, being an international diplomatic organization. Its missions are inviolable. So it could be that they want somewhere just out of the main drag, because the parliament there is just off the Rue de la Loi, the main drag in Brussels, so you can't really fence that off. But if they were to sit on the edge of the city somewhere outside the current Quartier Européen, they would actually have the ability to put a fence around it and declare it sovereign territory and get up to all kinds of nasties. Now, I've been inside that building as an interpreter, and I have to say, it's really strikes me as being fully up to spec. Okay, there's beams maybe peeling away or whatever in some dank corner of it, but it only went up in '93, for goodness sake. I mean, it's even got the modern interpreting booths, which only came in the late '80s, early '90s. So it's €500 million not well spent, and it shows that, together with the infringement procedures against the Central Europeans, shows that the European Commission is retrenching into cloud cuckoo land, which is exactly the charge laid against Jesse Klaver, the leader of the Green Left Party in the Netherlands, that he was living in a dream world.
When we showed the images of the NATO headquarters, the new NATO headquarters, a couple of weeks ago, one of the responses we got from somebody was that this reminded them of sort of an Enron situation. You spend your billions building yourselves a new headquarters just before you're about to collapse. Is this a recognition by the European Parliament of the existential threat they face?
Well, yes, particularly the European Parliament, I would say, because they were never conceived of as a joint holder of power. There's a three-cornered hat now in the EU: the European Commission, the European Council, and the European Parliament, and they each have a president, plus two other presidents. The EU has 5 of them, which of course always baffles the Americans and any other foreigners. Originally, the Commission was the big cheese. The Council only came in because heads of government were getting cold feet. Even the French presidents over the years wanted their say. And this Parliament was really just a gentleman's club. It wasn't even the main parliamentary assembly for Europe. That was the Council of Europe's parliamentary assembly in Strasbourg. And it's over decades of pressure that we have got elected MEPs, and direct elections started in '79. It wasn't for another generation that we actually got some MEPs from Britain, first of all, but now across the continent, actually wanting to look at the budget and actually wanting to ask leaders what's going on in the EU. So yes, you can see that the mainstream or elitist members of the European Parliament, who are still in the majority in the chamber, the ones who boo and cackle at the patriots, they're obviously going to want to do something big to reassert the project, because you've got Danes now, Greeks, Dutch, Hungarians saying openly on the floor of the chamber, we will leave this association if it transgresses the norms of a voluntary association of sovereign nation states. Unthinkable, of course, that would have happened a few years ago, but it has got to that stage now by the EU's own intransigence.
Alex, absolutely fascinating. That's coming to the fore. Just on the subject of money, I can't remember whether we're in the 18th year or the 19th year of unsigned accounts for the European Union. Of course, there's never been any signed accounts for the European Union because no accountancy firm is brave enough to sign off such a corrupt set of accounts. But it's the 18th or 19th year, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on. And Alex, just briefly, Britain is sleepwalking into joining EU army, warns top UK military commander. This is in the Express. And Politico, again, UK stands aside as EU boosts defence. So in the rare occasions that the mainstream media does cover this issue of EU military unification, they kind of obfuscate and hide the true scale of it, and make suggestions that the UK is stepping back and allowing this to proceed, out with its own membership.
Yes, I think that there's so many articles now in the continental press talking about military unification and the defence budgeting unification as a fact, that's no longer newsworthy. The last one I mentioned was El País, which actually said we have to wait for the Brits to have their election, and then once they're no longer looking, we can go further with the European military union plans. But this is newsworthy because mainstream English language titles are daring to say it. There's, as I understand from David Ellis, who's the expert on this, there's 2 camps of retired flag officers who are worried, and one is Veterans for Britain and the other is Major General Julian Thomson's group. There is some overlap, as I understand it, at campaign level, but Julian Thomson seems to have got the floor to say this, and the Express, as usual, has been, to give them their due, among the mainstream titles, the first to campaign openly on it, just as they were the first to call for us to leave the European Union. I will give them credit for that. But the depth is not in there, and no analysis of the need for our money to build the boondoggles like the €500 million new European Parliament buildings, replace the old new one. But there's no investigation further into why the European Union and the BIS needs our money to fund the currency propping up, really.
Yeah. Okay. Now NATO. This is RT reporting this. Up to 15 tons of depleted uranium used in 1999 Serbia bombing. Lead lawyer in suit against NATO. So this is an international legal team, they say, putting together a lawsuit against NATO over the use of depleted uranium munitions during the bombing of Yugoslavia. They are saying that has caused a rise in cancer-related illnesses across the region. And the quote from the Serbian lawyer is that the NATO bombing of Serbia in 1999 used between 10 and 15 tons of depleted uranium, which caused a major environmental disaster. In Serbia, 33,000 people fall sick because of this every year. That's one child every day. Now, RT reporting that the press office for NATO said it was aware of the allegations but wouldn't comment any further on it. But this is quite a move to sue NATO on this. And of course, they're also pointing out in their lawsuit that the same type of thing has happened in Iraq. But sticking with NATO then, Macedonia aiming to join, and a bit of amusement here because, of course, they're aiming to temporarily change the name of the country so they can join because of the conflict with Greece over the name Macedonia. But Alex, if we look at the map with Montenegro just having joined recently and Macedonia aiming to join as soon as it possibly can, Serbia would be right to be a little concerned about this.
It would. All these small countries are not placeable on the map by most people, but it's a ring of countries south and west of Serbia. And of course, to the east, you have Romania, which is now an EU and NATO member, to the Russians' horror. They joined both in the mid-2000s, last decade. Bulgaria, ditto. To the north, Hungary, which, is more Eurosceptic, but is in the EU and NATO very much. So Serbia is going to be encircled. I know it's an overused word, but it's true of Serbia and indeed of their Slavic ally Russia, except we don't see the encirclement unless you look at a polar projection and then you realize what's going on. Serbia is ringed, and the last time this happened, of course, was in the years leading up to 1914. We all know how that ended up.
And just a couple of sentences. What chance do you think Serbia has of succeeding with a lawsuit on the use of DU weapons?
I'm not quite sure which international body would take that on. There's the ICC, the ICJ. They all have different remits. The trouble is that you've got judicial activism these days, and appointments to these international courts are from people who were tin pot judges or no judges at all in their own nations. They're political appointees, so they can easily be prevailed upon to find a case inadmissible for spurious grounds.
Okay.
It's interesting, though, isn't it, that all of the pictures and the evidence and the film of the tragedy of from depleted uranium in Iraq, in the Middle East, have all sort of disappeared now quite conveniently from the mainstream press. But obviously those injuries are going to go on, and people in the chat room are also saying that this is a disaster for years to come, which is the truth of the matter.
Well, what's the SAS up to, Brian?
Well, this is an extraordinary story from the Mirror. It says that armed SAS troops are posing as beggars and road sweepers in UK cities amid fears of more terror attacks. And they say that G Squadron SAS and the Counter-Revolutionary Warfare Wing have now been deployed on the streets, but they're disguising themselves as beggars. And these are going to be the people, apparently, that hopefully stop future terrorist attacks, such as Manchester and London. Well, I took a little bit of time to actually read through this article, and the more I read, the more extraordinary it became. So let's sort of have a look at it in black and white. I called it mind-numbing stupidity of the Mirror report, and I'm going to stick by that. So we are to believe that the SAS are going to be disguised as beggars and road sweepers at key positions in cities. There's some 200 major cities or city areas in the UK, so populations of over 100,000. So this is quite remarkable how many men are actually going to be deployed, if we believe what we're being told here. It's hoped that the troops can stop any repeat of the London Bridge or Manchester attack. So we've got that key word here. We're hoping. We're not sure whether we can do anything. We're just hoping that maybe we might be able to do something. And then it goes on. It says these soldiers provide very good layer of immediate response. Well, how can they do that with the numbers deployed across the areas that's deployed? So you dig into this. I think this is a huge publicity exercise. And if you say, well, what are these troops? We've now got undercover troops
deployed on the street.
Deployed on the street. So the public has no way of knowing when they meet somebody, particularly it would now appear if they're sleeping rough, whether they're actually dealing with somebody in need or somebody who's got a really different agenda. The troops and police are stationed around transport hubs and in shopping centres. Well, that was good of the Mirror to put out, but there we are. The Mirror's decided it's going to say that. And then the Mirror has agreed not to disclose which cities the undercover units are positioned in or how many are in each team. Well, presumably not, because the thing just doesn't stack up. So we'll just put that statistic up. You can check that if you go and have a look at cities and mayors on the internet. You can come up with details about city areas and populations. But there's something wrong about this story. Well, I went back into it to have a look at a couple of other things that was said. The view is there are so many homeless people out there, undercover operators will remain safe and anonymous. So it's good news that we got so many homeless people on the street because it means that we can hide the SAS to protect us against terrorists.
That's a pretty cynical approach,
it's
isn't it?
Unbelievable, isn't it? Well, it's particularly cynical when you put this headline up from the Express. When was this? This is back in February.
Yeah.
7,000 soldiers left to rot on our streets. So we cynically use the people who've actually been there to defend their country. They're now abandoned by the state, rotting on the streets. But this is good news because we can hide the SAS amongst them. What a brilliant country we live in, Mike. This is extraordinary stuff. Anyone trying to pick on them will be extremely foolish, and the public should feel reassured that a lot is being done to minimise the effect of another attack. So you'd be foolish to pick on the people sleeping on the streets. Well, that's quite interesting because according to the Evening Standard, Westminster Council is planning to move homeless people out of London. So presumably they're going to be careful now because they might find a few of them are armed with automatic weapons. What can we add to that? Well, here we are. This is SAS, Counter-Revolutionary Warfare Wing. And I didn't know, are these people aware of this man? Here he is, Eric Pickles, community representative for the Conservative Party. I know I look like an unlikely revolutionary, but the revolution starts here with Eric Pickles. So are the SAS so stupid they don't understand who the revolutionaries really are, Mike? Because who's destroying the country from the inside? It's clearly the Tory party. And we just add a bit more because if you don't believe this, well, there's Eric Pickles in black and white. But we reminded you the other day that we had two people, Mr. Kruger and Nicholas Bowles MP, who both also said that the Tories were going to create chaos from within Britain. So I'm just a little bit saddened to think that we've got SAS people who are prepared to be on the streets with their military colleagues who are reduced to sleeping on the streets, protecting who? I don't think it's the British public. I think it's the criminals that we've got in government. I'm perhaps being particularly cynical here, Alex, but there is something just crass about this story and what we're starting to see on the back of this so-called terror threat.
Crass is the right word, Brian, because at the very least it's going to make people look even more askance at the homeless. And there are, against the protestations of many who claim that everything is faked, there are lots of Islamists and extremists who wish to kill people in our cities. And unfortunately, if they get wind of this, then we're just going to have a repeat of the Soviets' Nazi Eastern Front issue in 1943, I think it was, when the Soviets decided to wire up dogs with bombs. And obviously they put the bombs internally so that they wouldn't be seen. And when the Wehrmacht got wind of this, they solved it by shooting every dog in sight. So I'm afraid if you're a serious Islamist, not one of the patsies who also exist, and you're about to commit one of these atrocities, then you're going to read a story like this, and the first thing you're going to do is pick off every road sweeper and beggar you see on the scene before you start picking off the general public. So it's a very, very cynical manoeuvre.
We'll leave it there for people to think, but we become more speechless as the days go on, actually, with the situation at the moment.
Okay, Alex, this headline from New Zealand: blind 5-year-old described as a burden on the New Zealand health system is to be deported to South Africa. I believe the parents are still attempting to make a further appeal. And your question to me really was, where does this end? Does this end with euthanasia when we're describing anybody as a burden on a health system?
Yes, the New Zealand judiciary is noted for its mixed quality. Of course, the least best ranked judge in New Zealand no longer plagues the benches down there, because that's, of course, Dame Lowell Goddard, who tried to chair our child abuse inquiry in England and Wales, and then was sent away with a massive severance package for her failure to perform. And so there's others down in New Zealand who are equally cynical among the judiciary. Quite apart from the fact that you're saying that it's a crime for a blind and developmentally delayed 5-year-old to exist in a developed country, you're also sending them back to South Africa, where increasing numbers of whites are being slaughtered, even in the cities, but particularly on the farms in the veldt. So I don't know, this is another judge living in a bubble, or perhaps the judge in question really seriously intends for this family to be slaughtered for the crime of having a disabled baby.
Well, a kind of related story is from Bloomberg today, and the headline is "The Old Are Eating the Young." That's a spectacularly pleasant headline, Brian.
Yeah, but one we're detecting more and more. So we've got the bed blockers in the NHS, which are the old people who are preventing younger people from coming into bed. And the whole undertone is we need to get rid of old, useless eaters.
Well, that seems to be what's going on. So the subheadline is "Around the World, the Generation Divide is Worsening." And they say Edmund Burke saw society as a partnership between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. A failure to understand this relationship underlies a disturbing global tendency in recent decades in which the appropriation of future wealth and resources for current consumption is increasingly disadvantaging future generations. Without a commitment to addressing this inequality, social tensions in many societies will rise sharply. And they go through and list a whole range of statistics. Do have a look at the article if you want to read a bit more. And discuss it. They end by discussing the measurements that they've described and say that such measurements probably understate the shortfall that society faces, as they fail to account for the cost of environmental damage or higher commodity prices resulting from resource shortages. Future generations will bear the ultimate cost of present decisions for inaction, as in Francisco Goya's famous painting "Saturn Devouring His Son Today, the Old Are Eating Their Children." Now, I have to say that some of the points that are made in the article are fair enough because they are economic reality. But on the other hand, the old should not be the target for people's angst here, because the old are not setting economic policy. And so, once again, this is a diversionary article to divert attention away from the people that are actually responsible for the problems that we face. But again, this is another article which sort of hints, as you've suggested, Brian, hints at perhaps the old are just too useless to exist.
Well, I believe there is now an agenda within this country, at least, that the elderly are to be culled. And we're seeing key evidence from this, I'm very sad to say, within the NHS and the care system. If you haven't listened to the interview I did with 3 people, Mechanics of Modern Murder, as part of the Dispatches series, have a listen to that. And I can say that there is much more information to come, much of it coming from people within the NHS system themselves.
Okay, now Theresa May has been in Paris and well, she was giving a Mexican wave apparently at the football match last night, and how fantastic it looked. But anyway, censorship was really what she was discussing, or at least one of the things she was discussing. So UK and France have announced a joint campaign to tackle online radicalisation. This wasn't discussed in Parliament, of course. This is another one of these things that has just happened. Well, let's have a look and see what she had to say. Well, just as an aside, she did say this during her speech following the meeting with President Macron. But nowhere is our cooperation closer than the area of defence and security, with British and French fighter pilots flying alongside one another and in each other's planes over Syria and Iraq. So that's a little bit of an aside, but if there was ever evidence of EU military unification, then I think that statement there is it.
Well, it's absolutely it, Mike. And we knew this was happening in the Navy, and there are people who claim that the submarine Astute that went aground a couple of years ago was actually had French officers on the bridge of that submarine. We've never got factual evidence say that is correct, but that was certainly the allegation being made. And then we've had the collision between the strategic nuclear submarines, Vanguard and the Triumphant. And of course, it was Cameron who organised a 50-year deal with the French behind closed doors, never discussed in Parliament.
So let's get back to the censorship issue then, and what else she said in her speech out, or her briefing after the meeting. She said, as I've said before, in the UK, we're already working with social media companies to halt the spread of extremist material and poisonous propaganda that is warping young minds, but we know they need to do more. And today we can announce that the UK and France will work together to encourage corporations to do more and abide by their social responsibility to step up their efforts to remove harmful content from their networks. Note that she says encourage. So I wonder how she might encourage that kind of, we'll find out in a second. She said, we're launching a joint UK-French campaign to ensure the internet cannot be used as a safe space for terrorists and criminals, and that it cannot be used to host the radicalizing material that leads to so much harm. Crucially, our campaign will also include exploring creating a legal liability for tech companies if they fail to take the necessary action to remove unacceptable content. So is that how you would describe encouragement?
That's a threat, and of course that's a pretty serious threat. And so this is a threat she's making, having teamed up with France, which is no longer a democracy. So France is a police state at the moment. Theresa May, as part of her coup, teaming up with that police state in order to clamp down on the internet.
Absolutely. And she finished by saying, we are united in our total condemnation of terrorism and our commitment to stamp out this evil. So then, Theresa, please explain why we're funding terrorist groups in Syria, would be my question. But Alex, what are your thoughts on this drive that we've seen really since David Cameron's speech to the United Nations, I think 2 years ago, where he highlighted his desire to see the internet censored in this way?
Yes, well, this is the thing about it, Mike, is that it transcends party leaders and even survives the handover from one government or party to another. This talk of the difference between violent and non-violent extremists. I mean, the concept started with that of domestic extremists, which old hands in the British and American agencies and military hated to hear, but started to come in a few years after 9/11. And when I left GCHQ in 2009, there was still some tentativeness about using this phrase of domestic extremists, but apparently the new generation in counterterrorism has been trained in nothing but that. And they've taken it further to this idea that there are such things as non-violent extremists, which goes straight back to the Marxist doctrine by way of cultural Marxism, the doctrine of hate speech and violent and aggressive words, contradictions in terms, of course, unless you're inciting to violence. So we are in this category, apparently. We're doing nothing wrong or illegal or unlawful, but we can still be called non-violent extremists, which, it's like chalk and cheese. It's, again, an oxymoron. But it's a very useful way of getting rid of us. I mean, these attempts started in the US, which has the freest media scene, back in the Clinton era. Certainly, the early Obama era, they tried to get rid of shock jocks on the basis that there wasn't enough balance in their media coverage. So again, this is going to survive whatever government we have, because the speech writing, which is mentioning this stuff, is actually being done above and behind government.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll just add to that. If we've got censorship coming in, we've also got to watch what the media does. And I just thought I'd bring up this article from the Plymouth Herald. So, local newspaper, police boss issues statement over dangerous idea to tackle terror using vigilantes with guns. And then there was a caption under the image of our Alison Hernandez, our police commissioner. It said, listen to Police and Crime Commissioner Alison Hernandez say vigilantes with guns could be some of our solution to terrorism in isolated areas. And on it goes. But actually, she didn't say that at all. And you can listen to the audio clip and hear very clearly that she certainly never suggested that vigilantes should be used. She was responding to a question that a member of the public put to her live on air. And so I'm very curious as to why the Herald would attempt to put these words in her mouth. Well, they followed it up with another article, and now we can see a pretty vicious attack coming in. So the ex-cannabis smoker and gangster rap fan who became police commissioner. So this is a vicious attack on Alison Hernandez. Now, I am well aware that this is a common purpose trained lady. We can have a discussion about this. However, if we're talking about truthful reporting in the media, there's something pretty underhand going on here. And why do I think that they've come down on her like a ton of bricks? Because the political establishment are terrified of people able to defend themselves against the state or anybody else. And of course, the state has been traditionally very frightened of members of the public armed. And I think it goes back to just after the First World War, where the government got a little bit too uncomfortable with a number of weapons that had come back from the Western Front.
Any thoughts, Alex?
Yes, there's a whole raft in the safe Tory counties of southern England. There's a whole raft of these common purpose types. I'm afraid they're particularly from the demographic of clueless middle-aged females spotted and trained up from obscurity from the typist pool. There's several of them, if you look at them, who have that profile. Catapulted in to be the face and not much behind the face of policing. But one or two of them have used the tricks and skills they've learnt in you could say the third sector underworld, or even the literal underworld in a couple of cases, and they're now defending themselves because, as usual with the establishment, if you're useful as a particular kind of face and then you transgress your powers or your remit, then they'll try to get rid of you in double quick time. So Hernandez is suffering. Look at John Patterson's reporting on his own police and crime commissioner in Sussex. That's a whale of a story. A lot of this is going on. The PCCs we discovered a few years ago are unsackable, so that they've got some strange position at law. But they're very dangerous people because they are the civilians, as we always should have had, civilians controlling the policing. And particularly if they go anywhere near the idea that we have a God-given right to keep and bear arms for our defence, which we can never stress enough, applies in England and Wales and in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, regardless of any police licensing, because it's in our Bill of Rights.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, with an eye on the clock, let's just bring in a couple of other journalistic reports here. This is the Mail. I thought this was unbelievably cynical. So, another Facebook failure. BBC investigation uncovers the profiles of 22 convicted paedophiles on the site. So the Mail uses the BBC investigating paedophiles, this is the same BBC that couldn't investigate itself, in order to point a stick or poke a stick at Facebook. So I think there's more of this is an organised report here. It's based on nothing but cynical use of child abuse in order to get an attack in on Facebook. I think this is a despicable piece of journalism. It seems to have come from this lady, Shivali Best. We're on her Twitter page, and if we highlight here, she's getting very excited because she went to a briefing where she was the only woman in a room full of men. So not sure what's going on with the figures and the pyramids, but this is really crass journalism. I've used that word again. And then we could come into this one from the Mail. MP Anna Salisbury shares a photo from inside the Commons, but Twitcher catches her Tory colleague checking on something rather unparliamentary. There's a bit of detail about this, but here's the picture. And then a whole article made up over the gentleman in the foreground because there's something on his phone, and they do the detective work and then find it's a rather raunchy supposed artwork picture. But this is a major article. They can't investigate Melanie Shaw, they can't investigate child abuse, but they produce this trash. This is the journalist who's produced it. And if you want to know what's on the right, a little while ago in 2012, she wanted people who suffered from button phobia because she thought that would be a good article. So there she is, Steph Cockcroft. People say, what can we do all of the time? My reply today is get out and challenge these journalists in person, ask them why they're producing junk journalism, and ask them why they are failing to do their job, which is to stand up and be counted. And I was just going to, if I just jump through, sorry.
Oh.
No, it's okay, that's fine. I just wanted to remind people of the plight of Melanie Shaw. I believe that this lady should now become part of a major campaign, because if Melanie can suffer abuse and what can only be described as torture in a British prison, then that fate could be there for any one of us. And it's up to us. We either act and do something now, or it's going to be too late, because we're going to have the black cars arriving for any of us because we're non-violent extremists, according to Theresa May and her cronies. Alex, would you like just 30 seconds to close on any subject?
I just wish, Brian, that in Britain we had one senior politician of the calibre of Viktor Orban who said we will not be blackmailed into giving up our sovereignty. Just one would be enough.
Yeah, well, you really said it, because we don't have one, and therefore the only solution is that in an appropriate and cuddly way, I better add that, Mike, in an appropriate and cuddly way, we need to change our MPs, because clearly these people are not up to the job. We'll leave it there. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. And if you're not a subscriber to the UK column, perhaps you'd log on and subscribe, because we can only do what we do with your financial help and support. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.